folks. And as shown in the second slide, we have a YouTube channel. I will share the link of that in the chat soon. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. You will not be able to unmute yourself except for the four of us. That is me, Lee, Sandra, and Olga. Everybody else cannot unmute themselves. So please continue, Sandra.
All right, so you're seeing my first slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right, great. So as Paresh was saying, we met some years ago in Boston. I have a long history of working in law firms. I'll just give you a little bit of background about me. Working in IT, various roles, assistant to IT director, help desk, and technical trainer. So for many years, I worked as a technical trainer in law firms, 16 to be exact. And one of those law firms is where I met Paresh. I did a lot of instructional design, teaching secretaries and attorneys, various software. And it was a great, great profession to be in. I did want to take a change at one point, and that's when I moved over to cybersecurity. So I left from the legal arena to cybersecurity, bringing my instructional design skills with me. I was there in that space for about 7.5 years. And then from there, I moved over to customer success, bringing my instructional design skills as well into this current role that I'm in right now. And in this role, that's where I've learned a lot about data and how it can be used to help with a myriad of things, adoption being one of them. Hence my topic today. So, you probably all kind of have an idea of what data-driven adoption is, but one thing that I've been learning is the more you can learn about product and feature usage data, the more you can kind of address or see where there are gaps, and see where you might be able to address those gaps, depending upon what you're seeing in the data. So either way, it could be that it's an end user application that people aren't adopting, or maybe it's a product that administrators are supposed to be using and they're not. So health scores, that's another thing that you hear about. They can be helpful. You've got your CSAT scores, your NPS scores. They can give you an idea of the customer health, but they're not going to tell you the full story. It's not going to tell you and get you into the granular detail about feature usage or product activation or any of that. The customers might seem fine on paper, but you need to look at the data behind things to be able to get the full story and see where there might be adoption challenges. And if there are adoption challenges, you need to know about them early in order to address them before you might potentially lose a customer. So this slide, I like to talk about speaking with customers because I find it really important. So you've got the data. Now, what you can do with that data is use it to have these conversations with your customers. You can talk to them and say, hey, we're seeing that there's some features not being used. We're seeing that there's certain workflows that the product provides that are not being utilized. Maybe certain roles or departments aren't even using the tool. And maybe even some products aren't even being adopted. Again, whether it be the end users aren't using it, or maybe it's an administrator tool and the administrators aren't activating it or using it to its full functionality. So where can we get these insights? I know with customer success, the customer success managers, they meet regularly throughout the year with their customers in business value reviews. So that's one place to bring the data, to talk to the customers about it. In those reviews, you can learn a lot about the different things. So you show the data to the customers and you say, hey, we're seeing that this feature is not being used, or we're seeing that this product's not been activated. Well, they can probably tell you why. Or if they weren't aware of some of the things that you're sharing with them, you can work together to take actions to move the needle. Customer advisory boards are also very helpful. Oftentimes, a vendor can get insights from a customer to understand why certain features aren't being used. Maybe they get information that indicates they shouldn't even be pursuing, maybe investing in any more development of a certain feature because most of their customer segments don't use that feature. Power user interviews are also helpful, like champions. If you've ever heard of a customer champion, those are those people that really are invested in your product and they can kind of champion it throughout their organization. Sometimes you find out from them what the people on the ground are really experiencing. They might say, this is where we're struggling. This is where we're seeing value. They can give you a lot of insights. And then leadership coalitions. Those are another place that you can bring in folks from IT, different department heads, and maybe you'll get information about organizational things going on that maybe not are not out in the public, but they're something that's important for you to be aware of, that's going on with the organization. They might be able to tell you about different blockers that are going on at the time. So
Sandra, 2 minutes.
Insights are important.
2 minutes.
Oh, okay. So I was trying to think about a picture for this slide. So if you think about customers who if they're not using what they bought, basically they're going to question the investment. Okay. So if you have a piece of clothing, if you think about it and it sits in your closet, if you're not finding value in it, you're going to go and purchase something else. But it's the mission of customer success to help the customer realize the value early, before the customer goes and tries to shop for something else. This last slide is just, I'm talking about cross-functional alignment and how that matters with adoption. And it's very basic. These are all the departments that work at let's say a tech company. They all have their own KPIs, but they're all getting some piece of context throughout the customer journey that can help put that story together for the customer success team. We do have customer success platforms that can take integrations, pull things from different systems like a CRM. If you think about it, you can get information there. You can get information from a data lake, anything that can bring that full story together in a platform where customer success can see the full picture. And that's it. I tried to be quick, Paresh.
Yeah. Hey, time is everything, right?
Yeah.
So here's one thing. Maybe, next time you can actually take it a little further when you have, say, 1 hour session. What you are saying right now is how to use the data to make informed decision about customer success, right? And then how to help your customers settle down with your product or services, correct? But our friend here, Junaid Haja, 2 months back, he did a presentation on how to use data as a product itself. So your next graduation would be to use whatever data that you collect from your customer and then make sure that you can actually sell it to whoever, or at least for your own marketing successes, right? So to speak, using AI tools and such. But thank you, Sandra. Anybody have questions? Type it in now. I see my friend Latifa has joined, from Harris County. But yes, if you don't have any questions, let's go ahead and have Lee Markum take over. And Sandra, as I said, feel free to run after your dog or treat Eric if he's already home, right? But otherwise, hang on. I think what you learn from Lee is going to be absolutely priceless. You will
I've got the
benefit, I
broadband
promise
in
you
the
that.
room.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's a good thing. Cool. See you in
Great job,
Boston
Jennifer.
someday, my friend. Take care. Bye. Go ahead, Lee.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone coming. You're here to, for my talk at least, to hear about modern SQL Server features that make your life better as a technologist. So appreciate the invite and being able to be here this evening for sure. A little bit about me. I got into IT in 2008, and 5 years later decided it was time to try to get that first certification, mostly as a learning tool to help me, grasp what I was getting into. Was promoted to officially a DBA job in 2014. Was doing the job long before I got the promotion, like many of you, I'm sure. I have been ramping up the speaking. I got my start in New Stars of Data 2021. I do have a blog, and you can also email me at liam@leemarkum.com. Any questions about SQL Server, this presentation, or anything else. You can connect or follow on LinkedIn, and I also have a GitHub where the slides for this presentation will be. So we're going to talk about 4 general categories where there are modern features that will help you to make things easier for your everyday work life. We'll look at performance, troubleshooting, T-SQL, and some high availability and disaster recovery features. So diving right in, we're going to take a look at performance features, and the first thing we're going to talk about is just lightweight query profiling. This has several iterations, I think 4 actually, and primarily what it's great for is that you're going to be able to use this to see queries in process and see what are they doing, how far have they made it along, and that will give you the ability to make decisions about things like, should I kill this query? Or one that's very, very useful is, how long is this index creation going to last? How much longer is it going to take to finish this process? So it's a great feature for being able to see in-flight queries. What are they doing? How long are they going to continue, so that you can make decisions about that? In earlier or first iterations, it would collect CPU runtime. It doesn't do that anymore, but you still get IO and row totals for the operators that you see in the query plan, or that it will display for you in a text format for the query plans. And the way that you activate or see this information is by using sys.dm exec query profiles. And that was in SQL 2014 Service Pack 2. But as I mentioned, this has had several iterations. To get this in SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1, you can enable it globally using that trace flag I mentioned on the slide 7412. It is on by default in SQL Server 2019. So in that case, you don't need trace flag 7412. It doesn't really do anything for you. The next performance feature is sys.dm exec query plan stats. And what this does is it gives you the equivalent of last known actual plan for most of the queries that are in the cache. And you pass it a plan handle in order to see that last known actual plan. You can use a trace flag 2451 and enable that globally. You can also just turn this on for certain databases using the alter database scope configuration. So globally at server level, and also selectively at the database level if you just want to use this on certain databases that maybe are more sensitive to change, or that you want to monitor but maybe not monitor or get this from every database. Here is a slide talking about intelligent query processing, and I'm sure this has been updated. I haven't had a chance to update this for SQL Server 2025, but there are a lot of features. This is a whole collection. Intelligent query processing isn't just about one thing. It's about a collection of things that Microsoft puts together to try to help you so that it makes your life easier, better. You can tame your workday with some practical things that you can do for performance. Obviously, with so many features, I can't talk about all of those features, so we're going to be pretty selective. And that first one is going to be memory grant feedback. You got that feature, we get that feature in SQL Server 2017. You don't need the query store for this, and I mentioned this specifically because we're going to talk about query store with memory grant feedback in a little bit. So what this does in its first iteration in 2017 is it uses the cached plans in memory, and it updates those. You can use this, or how it works is that or the impact it makes is that it reduces spills to disk, and it also can reduce the wasted memory when it lowers memory grants that are too high. Every query that gets submitted gets a memory grant, or an amount of memory that SQL Server believes the query needs. Sometimes that is spot on, sometimes that grant is high, sometimes it's too low. When the memory grant is high, then you're just wasting memory and cache. When it's not high enough, then you get the spills to disk, which hurts your performance. So SQL Server will look at each query with this particular feature, and then decide when it sees it the next time, did I give it too much or too little, and make adjustments. This can sometimes result in a zigzag effect that happens where you get too much memory, too little, and it bounces back and forth. If that happens, it does disable itself for that query so that it doesn't just keep that zigzag pattern. And I really feel like this is a great feature to help you and to help the SQL Server engine without your intervention manage memory a little bit better. This feedback, because it is based on updating plans that are in the cache, is lost when SQL Server restarts, or if you add a recompile to a procedure, then that procedure statement will no longer be affected by memory grant feedback. You do need compatibility level 140 at the lowest in order to get this, and if you're going to get row mode grant feedback, you need compat level 150, which is 2019. Memory grant feedback activity, you can see it through the memory grant updated by feedback extended event. So you can query or run that and get the information stored in a file, or see it live if you want to try to do that. You can also see spill events through the extended event that I have there on the screen, spilling report to memory grant feedback. So there are ways to see what this particular feature is doing for your workload. Starting with row mode in 2019, there are a couple of additional query plan elements that you can get. The last requested memory and the is memory grant feedback adjusted. It just allows you to a little more visibility from the query plan perspective so that you can see what impact this feature is having. In SQL Server 2022, you get persistent and percentile memory grant feedback. Again, you need at least compat level 140 or higher to get this. Here you do need query store, because the idea here is we don't want to lose the information when the SQL Server is restarted, or sometimes patching, obviously that's going to reboot your server, that's going to restart SQL. So those are the two cases in which you're going to lose memory grant feedback in the previous version. But here, Query Store holds the memory grant feedback information for the queries in your system. And so this is why you need Query Store turned on and in read-write mode. This feature for memory grant feedback persistence is available in Azure SQL DB. It is not available in managed instance as of August 2024. And I know that was over a year ago. This is the most recent information I could find about the availability of the feature. So what does this look like in real life? The percentile granted, the blue part shows the percentile granted, and it does tend to err on the side of granting too much because it's trying to prevent the performance killer of spills to disk. But you can see that zigzag effect that you get with the previous version, and then the blue kind of has that escalating graph and kind of levels out. So it's persisted and has that percentile. It's trying to get that happy medium. DOP feedback in SQL Server 2022. This is degree of parallelism feedback. You do need compatibility level 160. And again, you need query store enabled and in read-write mode. This is a enterprise feature, enterprise edition feature. What this does is that it will examine a query. Let's say that you have what I'm going to call at the moment just a standard system. Maybe you have 16 cores in a single NUMA node, and for MaxTop you would set that to 8. So every query that goes parallel, it's going to use 8 CPU or 8 threads to go parallel. What this does is it examines queries that are going parallel with 8 CPU, and it says, you meet my criteria for DOP feedback. When I see you again, I'm going to use a lower number of CPU to run you parallel. So it might go down to 4. And it evaluates that, and it decides whether the query running at 4 is still performing acceptably compared to when it had 8 cores or 8 threads, 8 CPU. If it says yes, then the next time it sees the query, it's going to go down to 2. And let's say in this situation that when it only gives 2 cores to the parallel plan, then it doesn't perform as well. SQL Server notes that and says, 4 is my magic number for this query. So then it stores that, it persists that feedback in query store. And you can see that in the sys.queryStorePlan feedback catalog view. You can see this whole process play out. I think this is a great feature. I have seen it in workloads that I have managed, and it does make a difference for parallelism and CPU. This feature is on by default in SQL Server 2025. It is not on by default in 2022. You have to turn it on. You do need Enterprise Edition. Speaking of Query Store, let's talk about Query Store. This was a brand new feature in 2016. And one of the first things I want to talk about is how do you access it, or who can access it? Obviously, if you're in the SA role, you can access this, but a lot of developers don't have the SA role. And so they may say, well, great, the Query Store has some information, but I can't query production. If you talk to your DBAs and the folks who control the security for your SQL Server, ask them about the view database state permission so that you can see the internal Query Store tables that are created when Query Store is turned on for each database. You can, with that view database state, then also have access not only to query the internal tables yourself, but use the built-in reports that come within Query Store. So that's a little bit about permissions and how you get to it, but what does it do? Well, it aggregates runtime performance for your queries, and it gives you query plans. Those are the primary 2 things that you're going to get out of Query Store. And it will aggregate this information over a whole host of metrics, more than I have on the screen. And for each of those metrics, you can get the average, max, min, and some other statistical analysis across that particular metric. In 2017, you get weight stats. So you get categories like parallelism, buffer IO, and others. And in the graph that shows you those weight stats, you can click that bar that maybe it says parallelism, and you can click that bar in the report, and then it shows you all of the queries that were affected by parallelism in some way. In 2019, there were custom capture policies added, and what those do are things like tells the system only collect a query if it uses a certain amount of CPU, or if it has a certain number of executions, then collect the query. This was just an additional way added later to help people have more control over what query store was capturing and help with any performance overhead that might be associated with this. And this is always a question I get about query store is, well, what's the performance overhead? And I can say that it's going to be negligible for the most part. You do have to watch out for ad hoc workloads that send a lot of literal queries across. But even in those cases, I've been able to turn on Query Store and there wasn't a performance impact from having Query Store on. But it's never zero. Just keep it in mind, watch it, and it can be turned off as easily as it was enabled if you do think that it was causing an issue. Another great thing that you can do with Query Store is that you can apply hints without changing the code. This is in SQL Server 2022. So if you have a shop that has a lot of third-party vendor applications and you can't get the vendor to change the code, you could store a query hint within Query Store itself. So the third-party application submits its queries as it always does, and then Query Store applies a hint to that query to get it to behave in the way that you want and that's going to increase performance for you. You can compare two plans to each other side by side in the same SQL Server Management Studio window. So that's a pretty nice thing to be able to see the differences between query plans that Query Store shows you. You can track a stored procedure performance over time. So Query Store, when it collects a particular query, it assigns a query ID to that statement or stored procedure. And so what that does is it allows you to, over time, use a query tracking report to track the performance of that particular query or stored procedure over time. This does assume that no one drops and recreates the procedure though, because if you do that, then SQL Server Query Store will assign a new query ID to that stored procedure every time you do that. So you want to use create or alter when you're changing a stored procedure instead of drop and recreate. You can also force good query plans with Query Store. It will show you the number of different plans that a statement or query is getting. And then you can evaluate those plans and force a good query plan. There are caveats. So just because you force a plan doesn't mean that SQL Server has to use it. There are some cases in which it can't or won't use a forced plan. But for the most part, this is a pretty effective tool to get a good query plan when you're having an issue with performance. And then you can go back and work on that query later to get a more stable performance and remove that forced plan, or unforce the plan, I should say. Here's a list of reports that are shown in Query Store. I typically look at top resource consuming queries and then query weight statistics and tracked queries the most. It's not to say that the others are not useful. They certainly are, but those are the reports, the ones with asterisks next to them. Those are the ones I use the most frequently and really helpful for troubleshooting. When you turn on Query Store, you should also enable trace flag 7745, and you should also turn on trace flag 7752 unless you're on 2019 or higher. If you're on 2019 or higher, the behavior of trace flag 7752 is just built into the database engine. But these kind of address opposite issues. 7745 is for allowing SQL Server to shut down more gracefully. Without this, Query Store can actually prevent shutdown for your SQL Server because it's trying to flush data out of memory and down into the disk. 7752 will actually, or without that, you can have situations where Query Store will actually prevent queries from running while it's trying to load its data into memory asynchronously. And then once that's done, then it lets queries run. 7752 prevents that behavior. Query Store is a fantastic performance feature to see before after for anything, but especially in migration. So if you're moving up from lower SQL Server like 14, 16, 17 to 19, 22, or if you're really cutting edge, SQL Server 2025, you turn on Query Store before you upgrade, and then you can, once you upgrade, Query Store will still be on, and you can see the difference in query performance behavior before and after your upgrade and make comparisons that way. One of the interesting things for a performance feature is now in SQL Server 2025, you get Standard Developer Edition. You're like, Lee, that doesn't make sense. What the heck does Standard Developer Edition mean? Well, it's something that many folks in the SQL Server community have been asking for years, actually. And Ed Pollack wrote a Redgate article about it. And when you do the install in a lower environment, you can actually install Standard Edition of Developer Edition for SQL Server. Like, well, but why? Why would I want that? Well, it's because the Developer Edition before SQL Server 2025 is basically, it's the same thing as Enterprise Edition. It's just licensed differently. And so a developer might choose to build an application and use an enterprise only feature, but they don't know that it's enterprise only. And then they roll it out to production, which happens to be Standard Edition, and then that feature doesn't work anymore. So this is why having a Standard Edition for Standard Developer Edition is very useful. Another really great thing that you get in SQL Server 2025 is something called TempDB Resource Governor. And in fact, you actually get the entire Resource Governor feature available in Standard Edition now. But specifically for TempDB, what this is going to do is allow you to set up Resource Governor for TempDB and control the amount of TempDB space that is consumed by any particular kind of workload. And what this means is you can use Resource Governor to control queries like reporting queries that tend to use a lot of CPU, they churn through a lot of data, they often use a lot of TempDB space. You can control how much TempDB space is used by those queries. If they use too much or try to use too much, then there is a very clear message that you see on the slide that gets logged so that you know exactly what happened to your query. TempDB Resource Governance will actually kill that query when it tries to use more TempDB space than Resource Governor is configured to allow. So you can set higher limits for your default workload that's mission critical, set lower limits for custom workloads like reporting. SQL Server Standard Edition now supports 256 gigabytes of RAM, or you also have the lesser of 4 sockets or 32 cores. Previous limit was 24. So you have an increase of size of machine that you can use Standard Edition on and get more RAM and more cores for Standard Edition. The previous limit for RAM was 128. So you're getting double the RAM on SQL Server Standard Edition, so you can handle larger workloads. Here are some troubleshooting features. Mm-hmm. Yes. Is there a question? I thought I heard someone.
Okay, so in the lower Standard Edition of SQL Server newer versions, we do allow table compressions, right? I do believe we do, but I'm not 100% sure anymore.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was that question, Paresh?
So data compression, right, in higher versions of SQL, but in Standard Edition, we could do that, right?
Do you have data compression in Standard Edition? Yes, you do. There is data compression available in Standard Edition. I think that was 2016 Service Pack 2.
Okay.
So yes.
Yeah. So not totally out of whack. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Troubleshooting features. I wish we were in the room together and we could all do I could do a show of hands for people who've seen this and sighed deeply when they saw this message, because before SQL Server 2019, when you saw string or binary data would be truncated, the statement has been terminated, you knew that you got to go spelunking through the data to figure out where in the world did this error come from? What data caused this? And it's frustrating because you knew SQL Server knew because it threw the error. Why doesn't it just tell you? Well, fantastic news. You do get that in 2019 now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So you get a better message. String or binary data would be truncated. You get the table that was affected, you get the column name, and you get the value. So you get basically everything you need to troubleshoot this issue. And I just love this verbose truncation warning.
So this
Mhm.
error with level 16, I did a lightning talk at the summit, how to capture it. So if you want to try that, I can share the scripts with you. It's basically creating an extended event trace for level
Oh,
16 and or 20. And believe me, there are some scripts that are like 2 GB large. And the SolarWinds will tell you that could not be compiled, and that is why it could not be executed. Now you don't know what query it is because it never made it through to DPA.
yeah,
So I was able to create this as extended, and I was able to give the 2 GB query to my developer friends, and
very nice.
they thanked me happily ever after. So
Yeah, I mean, you send that along. That would be great. I would love to see that. Um, this book, The Verbose Warning, is just a wonderful gift. I just love it so much when I saw this. Um, if you're not on 2019, it was backported. So if you're on 2017, you can get this feature if you want to use trace like 460. You do need compatibility level 150 in 2019 by default, or it is available. I'm sorry. If your database is at compat level 150, then you get this by default without trace flags. Another feature that we'll talk about fairly quickly is temporal tables and system version tables. This I really like this for a reason other than the primary reason that it was released for, because I'm a DBA at heart. But the idea is that you're going to get a way to track changes to rows over time, and you can see what a row looked like, what the row of data looked like at any particular moment in time. You do have to have the temporal table or the system version table. The normal table must have a primary key in order to set up the system versioning, but it uses a range start and range end columns that exist in the history table to show you when that particular row of data was, I'll say, active or live in the system. You can use this as a replacement for triggers as a means of tracking changes. You don't get who made the change, but you do get all of the rest of the information. You can do some other T-SQL modifications to get the who as well as the what. You can also, if you're interested in more about tracking and auditing, you can check out the new ledger feature in SQL 2022. I will not be talking about that in this particular presentation. The biggest thing that it was created for, the biggest selling point that it talks about when you look at the documentation, is running queries to show trends over time. So you can see things like, how much did this widget cost over the last 30, 60, 90 days, for an example. The thing I thought of immediately is, oh, I can use this to recover data. I can fix oops deletes and other issues that might happen inside the system, because as a DBA, I'm always thinking about system protection and how can I recover. So you could use this to prevent a whole scenario that takes tons of time or can take a ton of time. If you had a 4 terabyte database, just as an example, and you're restoring that to I'm sorry, you're backing it up to the cloud. Well, it's going to take a little bit of time, and by a little bit, I mean a couple of hours, to pull down backups for a database that's that large. So if someone makes a mistake in a database and you need to restore it, and you don't have this on, you're talking about a couple of hours to download the backup. You're talking about time to then restore the backup. So 4 hours potentially has gone by before you can even start troubleshooting. Meanwhile, there could potentially be all kinds of chaos because data is wrong. With this, you can see what the data rows looked like at the time that the problem occurred or just before it, and use that history table to put the rows back to the way they were. This is the first thing I thought of when I came across this feature, and I think it's a great use. You can see a couple of examples of this in MS SQL Tips. Bert Wagner has also done an example of how to use temporal tables to fix problems within the data itself. I've also seen this used as a replacement for change data capture. So there's another way that this could be leveraged.
Snowflake has something called as time travel, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that is very analogous to this.
exactly. So this is kind of an example of both, really. This slide shows you those first, I don't know, 5 or 6 rows where the list price is $549.83. So if you update the product price by 10%, those original rows, the original price of $549.83 shows up, and you can see that those rows were active or available or live from January 18, 2024, 12:48:52 to 12:50:22. So 2 minutes basically, or a minute and a half in my little test. And then someone did it again. So you get more rows, and now that previous price that was 604 and some change is what you got from the first 10% change. So now you have a third price that's live or active in the system. Well, what if that second 10% increase was a mistake? Now you can use the rows that are down there at 12:50 and 22 seconds to query those rows and put that data back into the live system. So you can fix things without having to download a 4 terabyte database to fix uh, uh, an oops delete or an oops change in your system. T-SQL enhancements. I'm going to have to move a little quicker. We're going to talk about, or I'm going to show you an example of the inline specification, and I think all of these actually in some of these later slides. I do want to touch on the fact that there's a lot of JSON support in T-SQL that started back in 2016, and it continues to grow. Even in 2025, there are new things for JSON. So if your developer works with JSON, you can use SQL Server in JSON. I'm not saying you should or that you have to. I'm saying it's available. Inline index creation. So you can do things like create table, you have your column, and then just name your index right there with index and then a name, then column. This is a filtered index example. So I have a where clause there. You can also see I'm using an interesting syntax at the top where it says drop table if exists T1. So this allows you to get rid of a table if it's already there without lines and lines of code. Here's another example where you can have a multi-column index where you're creating that index directly in the create table statement. Here's a multi-column unique index that's non-clustered, and here's a clustered unique index, all within the table creation. This just saves you lots of typing from having to create an index after the create table. There's a lot of typing involved in that. So I think this is a nice way to get things done quicker. Here's some concatenation examples. So concat and concat_ws, which stands for with separator, are new-ish. concat underscore WS is the newest version of this. So I give you just some examples of what the syntax part would look like. And just think about how much less typing you're going to do if you use concat or concat with separator. There's a lot less happening on the keyboard with those newer functions. And I think it just makes coding faster to not have to do all that finger manipulation on the keyboard for plus signs and single quotes and commas and all of that kind of stuff. The product, or the end result for traditional concatenation, concat, and concat with separator all look the same. There are some differences, I believe, with concat with separator on how nulls are handled. So you would want to look at that to see how that shakes out. SQL Server 2022 has some enhancements, of course, for T-SQL, and primarily we're going to talk about that first one, greatest and least. What this is a function that works like max and min, but it's for columns instead of rows. So imagine that you are a company who sends out newsletters, and you put into a SQL Server database how many people open those newsletters, those newsletter emails that go out. Based on Aaron Bertrand's article that you saw on the last slide, this is what that might look like if you're going to try to summarize the email opens. You would have a year, you would have a month followed by an integer that would represent the number of opened emails. You're going to insert some data in there. I just did 2 years, but it's enough to show you what this could look like. If you use the case statement, this is just for 3 months. Imagine doing that for all 12 months. That would get really long and involve lots of typing. It would be hard to read and figure out, what does this do? You could use cross apply. This looks a little easier to understand. There's less typing involved. But what if you could just do this? Select year, best month equals greatest of whatever you pass in there. That's a lot less typing than this or this. So I think greatest and least could be really valuable and useful. There are a couple of other demos that you can look at the links there on the slide as well. High availability disaster recovery. We're going to have to move through this fairly quickly. I'm just going to do a comparison.
So you have little more than 9 minutes, so I wouldn't worry.
Okay.
Yeah, because we started your session at 10, so 10
okay,
past,
I appreciate that. Right? Thanks. So traditional things that have been around a while are things like log chipping, database mirroring, transactional replication, failover clustering. So what are some of the things that you can get in trouble with, or that are limitations here? So for log chipping, fantastic tool. Often you can use it with and have it be a readable secondary in standby mode, but that means that the data is not always up to date. There's a pause there when you have to pause it, restore data, and it's only good up to the last time you did a restore for it. There's also not a native, single built-in connection name, and it's only for one database at a time. Database mirroring, you don't even get readable secondaries. That's not even an option. You can get readable secondaries, sort of, if you take a database snapshot of the mirrored database. However, database snapshots have their own problems and limitations. And again, database mirroring is for single databases. Transactional replication. There are 3 kinds of replication, but mostly I see transactional as what's out in the wild, but you have to really love SQL agent jobs. There are lots of moving parts inside transactional replication. Beyond just that, I see a lot of situations where it's a showstopper because you don't have a primary key on every table that you want to replicate. And so it's not even an option. Again, there's no single built-in connection name, and the snapshots to get transaction replications needed can be resource intensive. Now you can get around that by seeding using backups, but that's typically not done. Snapshots are the most frequently used way to start the replication process. Failover clustering, wonderful product, wonderful feature. You do need shared storage though. And on some virtualized systems and storage arrays, getting shared storage is a non-starter. They just won't do it. So there are some things like block level replication or tools and software like Science Data Keeper or Click Replication Tool, Amazon FSx. But you have to then learn a third-party storage tool to make all of this work. And with failover clustering, it's a local high availability feature. There's no disaster recovery unless you either do like a stretch cluster, or meaning a multi-subnet failover cluster, or you use a third-party storage replication like we talked about, the Science Data Keeper or replication tool. So that leads us to availability group. It's the new kid on the block, sort of. It's been around for 13 years now. If you are on SQL Server 2012, first of all, my condolences. Secondly, please do not implement this on SQL Server 2012. It's way better on newer versions of SQL Server. But how does availability groups address these limitations? So there's no shared storage or shared storage trickery that you have to do via some other software that you have to learn. So this solves the failover cluster instance obstacle. Each node in an availability group has its own storage. It does provide disaster recovery via built-in data synchronization and multi-subnet configuration, which solves the issue with failover cluster instance primarily being a local HA solution. Now I'm going to stop here quickly and say this solution is meant for disasters, like external things. The solution is not meant for oops deletes or problems introduced into the data, because it will replicate those oops deletes within seconds. But that's not what availability groups or any of those other things are meant to try to address. So data protection is not the goal here. The goal is my SQL Server instance up and available? Can I connect to it and query it? Tables don't need a primary key to participate in availability groups, and that solves the obstacle that replication often has. You do have a built-in connection name for failover called the listener. You don't get this with log shipping or replication. Data is within a few seconds of the primary, which solves the obstacle of the log shipping. You do get readable secondaries. You can direct connect to any secondary node and query it, unlike with mirroring or log shipping. There's also a read-only routing feature. So you don't have to know the name of the secondary. You can just change the connection string and add an application intent read-only to that connection string. And when the query hits the listener, it sees that in the connection string and it reroutes your query to the readable secondary. You do get built-in automatic failover for a group of databases, and you don't get that with mirroring and log shipping, because mirroring and log shipping are for single databases. This is pretty easy to leverage for upgrades. You can make it more complicated, what I feel like is more complicated, by using distributed availability groups. Or you can do what I feel like is the easier route. And if you're going from, let's say, 2017 up to SQL Server 2022, and you already have an availability group in 2017, you can build two 2022 SQL servers add them to your existing failover cluster in Windows and your 2017 availability group and let them synchronize as secondaries. Then, when you're ready to fail over and do your upgrade process during your maintenance window that you scheduled, you just fail over to SQL Server 2022, and now you're up and live on 2022. Then you remove the 2017 SQL Server instances, you take those databases out of the availability group and out of the Windows cluster, and you're done migrating. You get automatic page repair, things like being able to manage objects outside the database. You can handle that with contained availability groups in SQL Server 2022. You do need some things to make this successful. You need a lot of people or multiple people, maybe not a lot, not the right phrase, multiple people who understand Windows clustering really well. You need multiple DBAs who understand the mechanics of availability groups very well, and you need good subject matter experts who know the network. If you're trying to do this in a cloud provider, please very carefully read the requirements for availability groups in infrastructure as a service. There are some gotchas, some things that you must do, or you're going to get yourself in a bad spot. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, backups and tested restore processes are your ultimate HADR solution. Availability groups help you with external disasters, backups, and tested restores, help protect your data when someone messes with it. Accelerated database recovery. This is one of my favorite features. So what this is it uses a persisted version story within the user database that you created or that you enabled the feature on. And there's a new secondary log. And what that does is it keeps those row versions in the secondary log so that at any moment, it can use those rows in the S log, that secondary log, to simply do a logical swap. So if you have a situation where like this slide, where maybe you're going to do a change to the email address format. You're going to go from first name and a number to first name dot last name for emails. And like any good process, you've tested this in non-prod repeatedly. You know it works. You're comfortable with it. But non-prod is like 1/10 the size of production, as always. So when you do this in production and it runs and runs some more, it runs even longer, and the developer gets nervous and they kill the query. If you don't have this on, if this has been running for, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours, it's going to take 2 or 3 hours to roll it back because the transaction log has to be read in a serial manner when you don't have accelerated database recovery on. With accelerated database recovery and that secondary log, it can take the row versions that have been stored and simply swap them and fix it and do the recovery quickly. The thing where I have seen this, thankfully I haven't lived through that example I just gave you, but the thing I have lived through is patching, where customers are supposed to stay out of your system, but sometimes they don't. Even though you tell them, hey, we're going to be patching the SQL Server on Tuesday night starting at 9 p.m. and we'll be done by 11. Please don't log into the system. They log in anyway, and they do things with it. And they may generate a lot of transactions before your patching actually finishes. And then it has to go through that serial recovery process I talked about. But with accelerated database recovery, that serial process that maybe was taking 30 minutes or even longer, which is what I was living through, takes a matter of seconds instead with accelerated database recovery. So I really, really love this feature. How can you get more information about new SQL Server features? Well, there's lots of ways. Obviously, Microsoft Learn, Microsoft Docs are a primary source. I really love MS SQL Tips. I've been reading MS SQL Tips articles for my entire career. They are fantastic to show you how to do all kinds of things. But every time a new version of SQL Server comes out, someone or multiple someones will write an article on new features in SQL Server. Here's some other places. The Pythian.com blog I've found to be pretty useful. Century1 usually writes some things, and there's a bit.ly link there for what's new in SQL Server 2025. That is a preview link. I noticed that some of the links for SQL Server 2025 maybe have been adjusted. I'm hoping that bit.ly link still resolves, and maybe I'll test that before I give this presentation again. In case I didn't cover your favorite feature or you were really hoping to learn about something else as well, here's some things that are kind of bonus material I didn't have time for. In-memory OLTP for certain workloads can be fabulous. Column store indexes are a wonderful, wonderful modern SQL Server feature. They are continuing to get enhancements since they were introduced in 2012. Data virtualization and external tables. I need to update this to say 2019 through 2025 because they've enhanced that in the newest version. TempDB improvements. If you want to know about TempDB, please look up Haripriya Naidu on LinkedIn. Find her presentations. She does give presentations on other things, by the way, but she has kind of become a de facto expert on TempDB because she talks about it so much. Really appreciate you being here and ready for questions.
So Haripriya actually spoke about this in February.
I'm sorry, what's that about, Jason?
No, about TempDB and in-memory objects and everything pertaining to TempDB. I think that's what you were talking about just like a minute back.
I'm sorry.
Can you scroll back a slide? Can you scroll back a slide?
This?
Yeah. So yeah,
TempDB
this is the one.
improvement?
Yeah, the last one, Haripriya.
Yeah.
She's from Boston, yeah, and she spoke the same topic earlier this year.
Yes.
And so let me just stop the recording though. I thought Olga will help me today, but no.